History tells us that ancient Greece was the beginning of philosophy, science, and higher thought, that civilization suddenly produced minds like Plato, Pythagoras, and Thales, as if wisdom appeared overnight. But civilizations don't rise from nothing. Long before Greece reached its golden age, Egypt had already preserved knowledge for thousands of years. Knowledge guarded inside temples, passed through initiation, and protected from the public eye. Greek scholars didn't deny this. They traveled to Egypt. They studied there. They learned there. Yet, when history was written later, Egypt faded into the background and Greece became the origin. Tonight, we explore the hidden foundations beneath ancient Greece, where its ideas truly came from, why Egypt was rarely credited, and what history never fully explained about the transmission of ancient knowledge. This is not a theory, it is a forgotten lineage. Stay with this story, because once you see the origins clearly, history itself looks different. The neat version of history you were taught in school makes it sound like Athens woke up one morning, stretched its marble arms, and invented democracy, geometry, and philosophy before lunch. But the truth is less like a miracle and more like a long inheritance. Egypt had already been calculating the stars, measuring land after the Nile's floods, and recording wisdom on papyrus scrolls, while Greece was still figuring out how to build a decent marketplace. Imagine Pythagoras, beard flowing, sandals dusty, standing in an Egyptian temple while a priest explains how ropes and stakes can measure triangles. He nods sagely, pretending he's just thought of it himself. Later, back in Greece, he unveils the theorem as if it were his own invention. The crowd gasps, the students scribble, and Pythagoras smiles, knowing full well the Nile had whispered the secret to him first. Or picture Plato wandering through Egypt, listening to tales of the soul's journey after death, the weighing of the heart against the feather of mat. He returns to Athens and speaks of immortality, judgment, and destiny, as though these ideas had sprung from his own mind. His students applaud, unaware that Egyptian myth had already carved these truths into stone centuries earlier. Egypt was not just a land of pyramids and mummies. It was a library of wisdom, guarded by priests who treated knowledge as sacred. The Greeks were students there, absorbing fragments of a tradition far older than their own. And yet, when the scrolls were written later, Greece was polished into the origin story, while Egypt was left in the shadows. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And hey, let me know where you're watching from, whether it's a grand temple, a cozy bed, or the couch you swore you wouldn't fall asleep on. Don't worry, I won't judge, unless you're watching from inside a pyramid, in which case, I'm impressed. Civilizations are not like mushrooms sprouting after rain. They do not appear suddenly, fully formed, with philosophers ready to debate and mathematicians eager to scribble proofs. They grow slowly, layer upon layer, like the stones of a pyramid or the rings of a tree. The story of Greece is often told as if brilliance burst forth in an instant, but the truth is that its golden age was built upon centuries of inheritance. Egypt had already been thriving for thousands of years before Athens began to shine. Along the Nile, farmers learned to tame the floods. Scribes recorded laws and rituals, and priests aligned temples with the stars. Knowledge was not scattered casually. It was preserved carefully, guarded inside sanctuaries, and passed down through generations. By the time Greek scholars arrived, Egypt was already ancient, its wisdom polished by millennia of practice. Think of it this way: Greece was the eager student, Egypt the seasoned teacher. The Greeks admired the monuments, marveled at the rituals, and absorbed lessons that had been refined long before their own culture took shape. Geometry was not invented in Athens. It was practiced in Egypt to measure land after the Nile's floods. Astronomy was not born in Greece. It was cultivated in Egypt to track the heavens and guide rituals. Medicine was not a Greek discovery. It was an Egyptian tradition, blending herbs with harmony. Civilization does not appear overnight, because wisdom itself is cumulative. Each generation inherits fragments from the past, reshaping them for its own needs. Egypt inherited from even older cultures, then Greece inherited from Egypt, and later Rome inherited from Greece. The chain of knowledge stretches back farther than textbooks admit, reminding us that progress is never sudden, but always a continuation. The myth of Greece as a sudden miracle makes for a tidy story, but the reality is richer, slower, and more human. Civilizations rise through patience, preservation, and inheritance. Egypt's temples stood as libraries long before Athens built its academies. And when Greece finally reached its golden age, it was not because wisdom had appeared overnight, but because Egypt had already kept the flame burning for thousands of years. Long before Athens raised its marble columns, Egypt had already carved its wisdom into stone. The Nile Valley was not simply a place of fertile soil. It was a cradle of knowledge, a civilization so old that by the time Greece began to flourish, Egypt was already ancient in its own memory. The Egyptians had mastered the art of writing with hieroglyphs, symbols that carried layers of meaning, sacred, practical, and cosmic, all at once. They recorded laws, rituals, astronomical observations, and medical remedies on papyrus scrolls, creating libraries that preserved knowledge across centuries. While Greece was still experimenting with oral tradition, Egypt had already built a system to ensure that wisdom would not vanish with the passing of generations. Mathematics thrived along the Nile. The annual floods forced Egyptians to measure and remeasure their fields, developing geometry not as abstract theory, but as practical necessity. Temples and pyramids were aligned with astonishing precision, reflecting both engineering skill and cosmic order. Astronomy was equally advanced. Priests tracked the stars, charted the movements of planets, and created calendars that guided agriculture and ritual alike. Medicine in Egypt blended science with spirituality. Healers used herbs, surgeries, and incantations, believing that health was not only physical but also a matter of harmony between body and spirit. Their medical papyri revealed treatments for wounds, fevers, and even dental problems, centuries before Greek physicians began writing their own texts. Religion infused every discipline. Knowledge was sacred, tied to the gods, especially Thoth, the divine scribe, keeper of wisdom, and measurer of the heavens. To study geometry was to participate in cosmic balance. To observe the stars was to read the destiny of the universe. Egypt did not separate science from spirituality. It wove them together into a single tapestry of truth. By the time Greek scholars arrived, Egypt had already been refining this wisdom for thousands of years. The temples stood as libraries, the monuments as textbooks, the rituals as lessons. Greece would inherit fragments of this vast tradition, reshape them, and present them as philosophy. But the roots were Egyptian, deep and ancient. stretching back into a past so long that even the Egyptians themselves sometimes spoke of their wisdom as eternal. If you picture Egypt in its prime, don't imagine dusty ruins or faded hieroglyphs. Imagine temples alive with ritual, their walls glowing in torchlight, their courtyards echoing with chants. These temples were not just places of worship, they were libraries, universities, and laboratories all at once. Inside them, knowledge was preserved with a care that bordered on reverence. The Egyptians believed wisdom was divine, a gift entrusted to humanity by the gods. To protect it, they stored it within sacred spaces, guarded by priests who acted as both scholars and custodians. Scrolls of papyrus lined hidden chambers, filled with records of astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Geometry was taught not as abstract puzzles, but as the sacred art of measuring the earth and aligning monuments with the heavens. Astronomy was studied not only to track the stars, but to understand the rhythms of the cosmos. Medicine was practiced with herbs, surgeries, and incantations, blending science with spirit. Access to this knowledge was not open to the public. Ordinary Egyptians saw the rituals, festivals, and ceremonies, but the deeper truths remained hidden behind temple walls. Only initiates, those who underwent symbolic trials and proved themselves worthy, were allowed to glimpse the scrolls and hear the teachings. This secrecy was not meant to hoard wisdom, but to protect it from misuse. Knowledge was powerful, and the Egyptians believed it should be handled with reverence. The temples themselves reflected this philosophy. Their architecture was precise, aligned with stars and solstices, embodying cosmic order. Every column, every carving, every chamber carried meaning. To walk through a temple was to walk through a textbook written in stone. The priests who guided scholars through these halls were not simply teachers. They were interpreters of the divine, revealing truths through symbol and ritual. When Greek scholars arrived, they were astonished. They had come from a culture where knowledge was debated in public squares, where philosophy was shared openly. In Egypt, they found a different world, one where wisdom was sacred, hidden, and preserved with ritual care. They studied eagerly, absorbing what they could, but they also carried home only fragments of what was stored inside those temples. The secrecy of Egypt's temples meant that much of its wisdom remained invisible to later history. Greece would be remembered as the birthplace of philosophy, while Egypt's role as the preserver of knowledge faded into the background. Yet, the temples still stand, silent but eloquent, reminding us that long before Athens built its academies, Egypt had already built sanctuaries where wisdom was treated as divine treasure. To understand why Egypt held such power over the imagination of the ancient world, you must picture not just its monuments, but the aura that surrounded them. The Greeks who traveled there did not see Egypt as merely another land. They saw it as a place where the divine and the human met, where wisdom itself was treated as holy. Egypt's worldview was built on math, truth, balance, and cosmic order. Every temple, every ritual, every calculation was tied to this principle. Knowledge was not just practical, it was sacred. Geometry aligned pyramids with the stars. Astronomy tracked the heavens to guide rituals, and medicine restored harmony between body and spirit. To study these disciplines was not simply to learn. It was to participate in the divine order of the universe. The temples embodied this sacredness. Their architecture was precise, aligned with solstices and constellations, designed to mirror the cosmos. Walking through them was like stepping into a living textbook written in stone. Priests guarded the scrolls of papyrus, revealing truths only to initiates who had proven themselves worthy. Wisdom was not for casual debate. It was for reverence, ritual, and preservation. For the Greeks, this was astonishing. In Athens, knowledge was argued in public squares, tested in dialogues, and shared openly. In Egypt, wisdom was hidden, wrapped in myth and symbol, revealed only through initiation. This secrecy gave Egypt an aura of mystery, making it seem less like a nation and more like a sacred library of the world. Egypt's sacredness also came from its age. By the time Greece began to flourish, Egypt had already been thriving for millennia. Its monuments seemed eternal, its rituals timeless. To the Greeks, Egypt was not just older, it was closer to the divine origins of wisdom itself. This perception shaped how Egypt was remembered. Even when Greece carried fragments of Egyptian knowledge home, it spoke of Egypt with reverence as a land of mystery and sacred truth. Later history would downplay this, but for those who stood in the shadow of the temples, Egypt was not simply a civilization, it was a sacred keeper of wisdom, a place where knowledge was treated as divine inheritance. When the Greeks began to seek wisdom beyond their own borders, their eyes turned south toward the Nile. Egypt was already legendary, its temples towering, its rituals mysterious, its knowledge whispered of in stories that reached Athens and beyond. For Greek scholars, Egypt was not just another land. It was the destination, the place where the secrets of the universe were said to be preserved. Pythagoras is often remembered as the man who gave us the theorem about right triangles, but before he became the sage of Greece, he is said to have studied in Egypt. There, he encountered priests who taught him geometry, not as abstract puzzles, but as tools for measuring land after the Nile's floods. He learned that numbers carried meaning beyond calculation, tied to harmony and cosmic balance. Later, when he returned to Greece, he presented these lessons as his own discoveries, but the roots were Egyptian. Plato, too, is believed to have traveled to Egypt. He listened to stories of the soul's journey after death, of judgment in the afterlife, of the weighing of the heart against the feather of man. These ideas would later appear in his dialogues, woven into Greek philosophy, but their echoes were unmistakably Egyptian. Herodotus, the historian, visited Egypt and wrote of its customs, marveling at its temples and rituals. Though he sometimes misunderstood what he saw, his accounts reveal the awe Greece felt toward Egypt's ancient wisdom. He described practices that seemed strange to Greek eyes, but carried deep meaning in Egyptian culture. Even Thales, often called the first philosopher of Greece, is said to have studied in Egypt. He learned geometry from Egyptian priests, knowledge that helped him predict eclipses and measure distances. His reputation as a pioneer of Greek thought was built on lessons first taught along the Nile. These journeys were not casual sightseeing trips. They were pilgrimages, quests for wisdom. The Greeks endured initiations, rituals, and symbolic trials to gain access to Egypt's teachings. They carried fragments of this knowledge home, reshaped it, and presented it in their own language. But behind the polished marble of Greek philosophy lay the shadow of Egyptian temples. The story of Greek scholars in Egypt reminds us that wisdom travels. It is inherited, adapted, and transformed. Greece's golden age was not born in isolation. It was nurtured by journeys southward, by scholars who sat at the feet of Egyptian priests, listening to truths that had been preserved for thousands of years. When Greek scholars arrived in Egypt, they quickly discovered that wisdom was not handed out like bread in the marketplace. It was hidden, guarded, and revealed only through initiation. The temples were not classrooms in the Greek sense. They were sanctuaries where knowledge was treated as sacred, and entry into that knowledge required more than curiosity. It required transformation. Initiation was both symbolic and practical. Scholars were led through darkened chambers where torches flickered against walls covered in hieroglyphs. They were asked to endure silence, to meditate on symbols, to pass through rituals that tested their patience and resolve. These were not mere ceremonies. They were lessons in themselves. To walk through darkness and emerge into light was to understand that wisdom required effort, discipline, and humility. The priests who guided them did not lecture in straightforward terms. They spoke in allegories, wrapped truths in myth, and revealed knowledge in fragments. Geometry was taught not only as a way to measure land, but as a reflection of cosmic order. Astronomy was explained not only as the movement of stars, but as the rhythm of destiny. Medicine was practiced not only to heal the body, but to restore harmony between spirit and flesh. For the Greeks, this was a revelation. In Athens, philosophy was debated openly, tested in dialogues, and shared in public squares. In Egypt, wisdom was hidden, revealed only to those who proved themselves worthy. The secrecy gave knowledge an aura of mystery, making it feel less like information and more like initiation into a sacred lineage. The experience left its mark. Pythagoras, Plato, and others carried fragments of these initiations home, reshaping them into Greek philosophy. But the echoes of Egypt remained. The idea that wisdom required discipline, that truth was hidden behind symbols, that knowledge was more than utility. These lessons lingered in Greek thought, even if their Egyptian origins were later forgotten. Learning through initiation meant that Egypt's wisdom was never simply copied. It was absorbed, transformed, and carried forward by those who had endured the rituals. The temples ensured that knowledge was preserved with reverence. And the Greeks, though they reshaped it, never forgot the awe of walking through Egypt's sacred halls, where wisdom was not taught but revealed. When Greek scholars entered the temples of Egypt, they did not receive a full syllabus neatly laid out for them. Instead, they were given fragments, lessons carefully chosen, truths revealed in layers. Egypt's priests were guardians of wisdom, and they understood that knowledge was power. Some teachings were shared openly, while others were hidden behind symbols, rituals, and silence. What was taught to the Greeks were the practical disciplines: geometry, astronomy, medicine, and writing. Geometry was explained as the art of measuring land, a necessity after the Nile's floods. Astronomy was taught as a way to track the stars and seasons, guiding agriculture and ritual. Medicine was shared through remedies, herbs, and surgical techniques, blending science with spirit. Writing was introduced as a tool to record laws, ideas, and observations. These lessons were useful, portable, and could be carried home to Greece without revealing the deepest mysteries. But much was hidden. The Egyptians believed that wisdom was sacred, inseparable from the divine order of the universe. Numbers were not just calculations. They were symbols of harmony. Stars were not just lights in the sky. They were signs of destiny. Healing was not just physical. It was spiritual balance. These deeper truths were reserved for initiates, revealed only through rituals that tested discipline and devotion. To the unprepared, they remained veiled. The Greeks absorbed what they could, reshaping it into philosophy. Pythagoras carried home the idea of numbers as harmony, though he presented it in Greek terms. Plato echoed Egyptian myths of the soul's journey, though he framed them as dialogues. Yet the full context, the sacred rituals, the divine connections, was left behind. This division between what was taught and what was hidden shaped history. Greece became known for its philosophy, its public debates, its open academies. Egypt remained mysterious, its wisdom locked inside temples, its deeper truths whispered only to the initiated. Later generations remembered Greece as the origin, forgetting that Egypt had taught the lessons and hidden the rest. The silence of what was hidden is as important as the knowledge that was shared. It reminds us that wisdom is not only about facts, but about meaning, not only about utility, but about reverence. Egypt gave Greece fragments of its treasure, but the heart of its sacred knowledge remained guarded, preserved in temples that still stand, silent but eloquent, waiting for those who listen closely. As centuries passed, the story of Greece and Egypt was retold, reshaped, and simplified. What had once been acknowledged, that Greek scholars traveled to Egypt, studied there, and carried fragments of its wisdom home, gradually faded into silence. Later historians praised Greece as the origin of philosophy and science, while Egypt was relegated to the background, admired for its monuments, but dismissed as mystical. This silence was not accidental. It was the result of cultural pride, political convenience, and the natural erosion of memory. Greece became the celebrated model for Europe, the symbol of rational thought and democratic ideals. To admit that its wisdom was inherited from Egypt would complicate the narrative, making Greece less of a miracle and more of a continuation. And so, the Egyptian roots were quietly ignored. The temples that had once preserved knowledge became ruins, their scrolls lost or hidden. The rituals that had once revealed truths through initiation were forgotten. Egypt's role as the teacher was overshadowed by Greece's fame as the student who became celebrated. The silence grew louder with time, until Egypt was remembered only for pyramids, mummies, and mystery, while Greece was remembered for philosophy, mathematics, and science. Yet the echoes remain. The geometry of Pythagoras, the philosophy of Plato, the astronomy of Thales, all carry traces of Egypt's wisdom. The silence in later history does not erase the truth, it only hides it. Beneath the polished marble of Greece lies the shadow of Egypt's temples, waiting to be remembered. This silence is itself a lesson. History is not only about what is told, but also about what is left unsaid. To understand the past fully, we must listen not only to the voices that speak, but also to the echoes that were silenced. Egypt's role may have faded in later history, but its wisdom still flows quietly beneath the story of Greece, like the Nile beneath the desert sands. As the centuries rolled forward, the story of Greece became polished into legend. Athens was celebrated as the birthplace of philosophy, geometry, and science, while Egypt was quietly pushed into the background. The question is, why? Why did Egypt, the civilization that had already preserved wisdom for thousands of years, rarely receive credit for its role as teacher? One reason was cultural pride. Greece wanted to be seen as the origin, not the heir. To admit that its greatest thinkers had studied in Egypt would make its golden age look less like a miracle and more like a continuation. The narrative of sudden brilliance was far more appealing than the truth of borrowed wisdom. Another reason was translation. Egyptian knowledge was encoded in hieroglyphs, rituals, and myths. When fragments of this wisdom crossed into Greece, they were reshaped into Greek language and philosophy. The sacred context was stripped away, leaving abstract theories that seemed uniquely Greek. Over time, the Egyptian roots became harder to see, hidden beneath layers of reinterpretation. Politics also played a role. As Greece rose in influence, Egypt's power waned. Later historians, writing from Rome and Europe, looked to Greece as their cultural ancestor. Egypt was admired for its monuments, but dismissed as mystical, exotic, or archaic. It was easier to celebrate Greece as the rational origin than to acknowledge Egypt as the sacred foundation. Finally, secrecy contributed to the silence. Egypt guarded its wisdom inside temples, revealing truths only through initiation. Much of its knowledge remained hidden, inaccessible to outsiders. The Greeks carried home fragments, but the deeper context stayed locked in Egypt. Later generations, seeing only the fragments, assumed Greece had invented them. The result was a simplified history, one that praised Greece while leaving Egypt in shadow. Yet the monuments still whisper of the truth. The geometry of pyramids, the astronomy of temples, the medicine of papyri, all remind us that Egypt was rarely credited, not because it lacked wisdom, but because history preferred a cleaner story. Behind the marble of Athens lies the stone of Egypt, silent but enduring, waiting to be remembered. Long before Greek philosophers began debating in marble courtyards, Egypt had already mastered the tools of civilization: writing, mathematics, and measurement. These were not abstract pursuits, but practical necessities, born from the rhythms of the Nile and the demands of daily life. Yet they carried a sacred dimension, woven into Egypt's worldview, and later became the foundation upon which Greece built its reputation for wisdom. Writing in Egypt was more than communication. It was a bridge between the human and the divine. Hieroglyphs were symbols layered with meaning, capable of recording laws, rituals, astronomical observations, and medical remedies. Scribes were not mere clerks. They were guardians of memory, ensuring that knowledge survived across centuries. Papyrus scrolls filled temple libraries, preserving wisdom that Greek scholars would later encounter and reshape into their own traditions. Mathematics flourished along the Nile because the river demanded it. Each year, floods erased boundaries, forcing Egyptians to measure and remeasure their fields. Geometry was born from this necessity, refined into a discipline that aligned pyramids with astonishing precision and guided the construction of temples. Numbers were not only tools of calculation, they were symbols of harmony, reflections of cosmic order. Measurement extended beyond land and stone. Time itself was measured with care. Egyptian astronomers tracked the stars, charted the movements of planets, and created calendars that guided agriculture and ritual. Their observations were so precise that temples were aligned with solstices and constellations, embodying the belief that human life must remain in balance with the cosmos. Medicine, too, relied on measurement of herbs, of balance, of harmony between body and spirit. Egyptian healers recorded treatments for wounds, fevers, and even dental problems, centuries before Greek physicians began writing their own texts. These remedies were preserved in papyri, blending science with spirituality, calculation with reverence. When Greek scholars traveled to Egypt, they encountered this vast tradition. They learned geometry from priests, astronomy from temple rituals, and writing from scribes. They carried fragments of these disciplines home, reshaping them into Greek philosophy and science. Yet the roots remained Egyptian, deep and ancient, stretching back into a past so long that even the Egyptians themselves spoke of their wisdom as eternal. Writing, mathematics, and measurement were not inventions of Greece. They were inheritances from Egypt. The Greeks polished them, debated them, and presented them as their own. But beneath every theorem, every calculation, every philosophical dialogue lies the imprint of Egypt's temples, where knowledge was preserved not only for utility, but for the sacred balance of the universe. In Egypt, wisdom was never treated as casual information. It was sacred, guarded inside temples, revealed only through initiation, and preserved with reverence. Knowledge was seen as a divine inheritance, a gift from the gods, inseparable from truth and cosmic balance. To study geometry was not merely to measure land, it was to participate in the order of the universe. To observe the stars was not simply astronomy, it was to read destiny written across the heavens. To heal the body was not only medicine, it was restoring harmony between spirit and flesh. This sacred approach meant that knowledge carried weight. It was not debated in marketplaces or shared freely with anyone who asked. It was entrusted to priests, initiates, and those who had proven themselves worthy. The secrecy gave wisdom an aura of mystery, making it feel less like information and more like initiation into a divine lineage. Greece, however, reshaped this tradition. When Greek scholars carried fragments of Egyptian wisdom home, they transformed it into public philosophy. Geometry became a discipline taught openly, stripped of its sacred context. Astronomy became a science of observation, separated from ritual. Medicine became a practice of physical remedies, detached from spiritual harmony. Philosophy itself became a public dialogue, debated in academies and squares, accessible to anyone willing to listen. This shift was profound. Egypt treated wisdom as sacred, hidden, and divine. Greece treated wisdom as rational, open, and human. The transformation made knowledge more accessible, but it also severed its connection to the sacred. What had once been guarded as holy truth became public theory, debated and tested without ritual. The difference between sacred knowledge and public philosophy shaped the way history remembered these civilizations. Greece was celebrated as the birthplace of rational thought, while Egypt was remembered as mystical and archaic. Yet beneath Greece's public philosophy lay Egypt's sacred foundation, the hidden lineage that gave birth to the ideas later polished in Athens. The story reminds us that knowledge is not only about facts, but about meaning. Egypt preserved wisdom as sacred. Greece reshaped it as public. Both approaches mattered, but the sacred roots are too often forgotten, buried beneath the marble of Greek philosophy, waiting to be remembered. Knowledge is never static. It travels, transforms, and takes on new shapes as it moves from one culture to another. The story of Egypt and Greece is one of transmission, wisdom crossing borders, carried by scholars, reshaped by language, and remembered differently depending on who told the tale. Egypt preserved its wisdom inside temples, guarded by priests who treated knowledge as sacred. When Greek scholars arrived, they absorbed fragments of this tradition. Geometry, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were taught in ways that reflected Egypt's worldview. Numbers as harmony, stars as destiny, healing as balance. The Greeks carried these lessons home, but once transplanted into Athens, they began to change. Language was the first transformation. Egyptian hieroglyphs were layered with meaning, blending the sacred and the practical. Greek words, by contrast, leaned toward clarity and abstraction. When Egyptian ideas were translated into Greek, much of their symbolic depth was lost. Geometry became a discipline of lines and angles, stripped of its sacred context. Astronomy became a science of observation, detached from ritual. Medicine became a practice of remedies, separated from spiritual harmony. Culture was the second transformation. Egypt treated wisdom as divine inheritance, revealed only through initiation. Greece treated wisdom as public philosophy, debated in academies and marketplaces. What had been hidden behind temple walls became open dialogue, accessible to anyone willing to listen. This openness gave Greece its reputation as the birthplace of philosophy. But it also meant that the sacred dimension of Egyptian knowledge faded into the background. Memory was the third transformation. As Greece rose in influence, Egypt's role as teacher was gradually forgotten. Later historians celebrated Greece as the origin, simplifying the story into a neat narrative of sudden brilliance. Egypt was admired for its monuments, but dismissed as mystical, its wisdom overshadowed by Greece's fame. Yet the transmission of wisdom is clear. The geometry of Pythagoras, the philosophy of Plato, the astronomy of Thales, all carry traces of Egypt's teachings. The chain of inheritance stretches across cultures, reminding us that progress is never born in isolation. Wisdom crosses borders, reshapes itself, and continues its journey, carrying echoes of the civilizations that first preserved it. The story of how wisdom crossed from Egypt to Greece is not just about history. It is about the nature of knowledge itself. It reminds us that ideas are travelers, moving through time and space, changing as they go, but always carrying with them the imprint of their origins. In the Egyptian worldview, wisdom was not simply a human achievement. It was a divine gift embodied in the god Thoth. To the Egyptians, Thoth was more than a deity. He was the cosmic scribe, the keeper of records, the measurer of time, and the guardian of truth. Every scroll of papyrus, every calculation of geometry, every observation of the stars was believed to carry his imprint. Thoth was often depicted with the head of an ibis, a bird associated with precision and balance. In other images, he appeared as a baboon, symbolizing watchfulness and intelligence. He was said to have invented writing, giving humanity the ability to record laws, rituals, and wisdom so that knowledge would not vanish with memory. He was also the divine judge, present at the weighing of the heart in the afterlife, ensuring that truth and balance were upheld. For the Egyptians, Thoth was the embodiment of sacred knowledge. Geometry was his gift, used to measure the earth and align temples with the heavens. Astronomy was his domain, guiding priests to track the stars and chart the rhythms of the cosmos. Medicine was under his care, blending herbs and incantations to restore harmony. Even time itself was measured by Thoth, who was said to count the days and mark the seasons. When Greek scholars encountered Egypt, they encountered Thoth's legacy. Though they did not worship him, they absorbed the disciplines he represented: writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and carried them home. In Greece, these teachings were reshaped into philosophy and science, but the divine figure behind them was left behind. Thoth's presence reminds us that Egypt did not separate knowledge from the sacred. To learn was to participate in divine order. To study was to honor the gods, and to preserve wisdom was to serve eternity. The Greeks inherited the lessons, but stripped away the god, presenting knowledge as human achievement rather than divine gift. Yet the shadow of Thoth lingers. Every theorem, every calculation, every philosophical dialogue carries echoes of the ibis-headed scribe who first preserved wisdom along the Nile. He remains the silent keeper of knowledge, reminding us that behind Greece's brilliance lies Egypt's sacred foundation, guarded by a god who measured truth itself. When wisdom crossed from Egypt into Greece, it did not arrive as raw knowledge alone. It carried with it symbols, myths, and divine figures. Just as Egypt had Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe, guardian of truth and cosmic order, Greece shaped its own reflection of this archetype, Hermes. Hermes, in Greek tradition, was the messenger of the gods, the guide of souls, and the patron of communication, language, and boundaries. He was swift, clever, and liminal, moving between worlds, bridging the divine and the human. Where Thoth recorded truth with precision, Hermes carried messages with speed and wit. Both figures embodied the idea that knowledge was not static, but a living force, moving between realms and shaping destiny. The parallels are striking. Thoth, as scribe, gives Hermes as messenger. Both ensured that divine words reached humanity. Thoth, as measurer of time, gives Hermes as guide of transitions. Both marked beginnings and endings, ensuring balance. Thoth, as judge in the afterlife, gives Hermes as psychopomp, leading souls to the underworld. Both connected human fate with divine order. Thoth, as inventor of writing, gives Hermes as patron of language and rhetoric. Both gave humanity the tools to preserve and transmit wisdom. Yet the Greek Hermes was more playful, more humanized. He was a trickster as well as a guide, embodying the Greek tendency to make divine figures accessible, relatable, and woven into everyday life. Egypt's Thoth was solemn, sacred, and eternal. Greece's Hermes was witty, agile, and worldly. In this transformation, we see how Egypt's sacred archetypes were reshaped into Greek mythology, reflecting the shift from hidden wisdom to public storytelling. Hermes became the Greek reflection of Thoth, not identical, but resonant. He carried forward the idea that knowledge is movement, that wisdom travels, that truth is not locked in temples but carried across boundaries. Through Hermes, Greece inherited the echo of Egypt's divine scribe, reshaped into a figure who embodied communication, transition, and the living flow of ideas. In Hermes, we glimpse how Egypt's sacred lineage was remembered in Greece, transformed, humanized, but never erased. He stands as proof that myths, like wisdom itself, cross cultures, adapting to new languages while carrying the imprint of their origins. When wisdom crossed from Egypt into Greece, it did not remain the same. Knowledge is never static. It transforms as it travels, reshaped by language, culture, and worldview. The movement of ideas from the temples of Egypt to the academies of Greece marked a profound shift, one that changed not only how knowledge was preserved, but how it was understood. In Egypt, knowledge was sacred, tied to the gods, guarded inside temples, and revealed only through initiation. In Greece, knowledge became secularized. Geometry, astronomy, and medicine were stripped of their ritual context and presented as rational disciplines. What had been divine inheritance became human achievement. Egyptian wisdom was preserved in secrecy, accessible only to priests and initiates. Greek philosophy was debated openly in marketplaces and academies. Knowledge became a public dialogue, accessible to anyone willing to listen, transforming wisdom into a shared cultural identity. Egyptian teachings were wrapped in myth and symbol, numbers as harmony, stars as destiny, medicine as balance of spirit. Greek scholars translated these lessons into abstract theories. Numbers became mathematics, stars became astronomy, medicine became science. The symbolic depth was reduced, but the clarity increased. Egypt saw its wisdom as timeless, eternal, part of the cosmic order. Greece placed knowledge within human history, attributing discoveries to individual thinkers, Pythagoras, Plato, Thales, rather than to divine figures like Thoth. Knowledge became personal achievement rather than sacred continuity. Egypt focused on preserving wisdom, ensuring it survived unchanged across centuries. Greece emphasized innovation, reshaping inherited ideas into new forms, testing them through debate, and presenting them as fresh discoveries. This gave Greece its reputation for originality, even though the roots were Egyptian. The movement of knowledge from Egypt to Greece was not a simple transfer. It was a transformation. Egypt preserved wisdom as sacred truth, while Greece reshaped it into rational philosophy. The change made knowledge more accessible, but it also severed its connection to the divine. What changed when knowledge moved was not the content alone, but its meaning. Egypt taught wisdom as eternal balance. Greece taught wisdom as human inquiry. Together, they created a legacy that shaped the foundations of Western thought, a blend of sacred preservation and public philosophy, of divine inheritance and human debate. As wisdom moved from Egypt into Greece, and from Greece into Rome and later Europe, something subtle but profound was lost. Context. Knowledge that had once been embedded in ritual, myth, and sacred meaning was gradually stripped of its original framework. Over time, the fragments that survived were remembered as isolated discoveries, disconnected from the culture that had first nurtured them. In Egypt, geometry was tied to the Nile's floods and the alignment of temples with the stars. It was both practical and sacred, a way of participating in cosmic balance. In Greece, geometry became abstract theory, debated in academies and written in proofs. The ritual context, the connection to the rhythms of nature and the divine, faded away. Egyptian myths carried lessons about morality, balance, and the soul's journey. They were symbolic frameworks that gave meaning to knowledge. In Greece, these myths were reshaped into philosophical dialogues. Plato spoke of the soul's immortality, but the Egyptian rituals of judgment and balance were no longer visible. The mythic roots were hidden beneath rational language. Egypt saw wisdom as divine inheritance, guarded by thoth and preserved in temples. Knowledge was eternal, part of the cosmic order. Greece reframed wisdom as human discovery, attributing ideas to individual thinkers. Pythagoras, Thales, Plato. The divine lineage was replaced by personal genius, and the sacred dimension was lost. Egypt focused on preserving wisdom unchanged across millennia, ensuring continuity. Greece emphasized innovation, reshaping inherited ideas into new forms. While this gave Greece its reputation for originality, it also meant that the continuity of Egypt's worldview was broken. Later generations remembered Greece as the birthplace of philosophy and science. While Egypt was reduced to monuments and mystery, the context of Egypt's role as teacher was silenced, leaving only fragments visible in Greek texts. The loss of context over time is not just about forgetting Egypt's role. It is about forgetting the meaning that once surrounded knowledge. Geometry, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were not merely disciplines. They were sacred practices tied to balance, myth, and divine order. As knowledge moved, it became more accessible, but also more fragmented. What remains today are the polished fragments of Greece, celebrated as origins. What is often forgotten is the deeper context of Egypt, where wisdom was preserved as sacred truth. The loss of context reminds us that history is not only about what survives, but also about what is stripped away in the process of transmission. As centuries passed, the complex relationship between Egypt and Greece was retold in ways that made the narrative cleaner, easier, and more flattering to later cultures. The transmission of wisdom from Egyptian temples to Greek academies was gradually reduced to a simplified story. Greece as the origin of philosophy, Egypt as a land of monuments and mystery. Historians and storytellers preferred neat beginnings. It was easier to say that philosophy began in Athens than to trace its roots through Egypt's temples and rituals. Greece became the birthplace of rational thought, while Egypt was remembered only as ancient and exotic. Egypt's wisdom was layered with myth, ritual, and sacred meaning. Greece reshaped it into abstract theories. Later history ignored the Egyptian context, presenting Greek ideas as original inventions. What had been a chain of inheritance was retold as a sudden spark of brilliance. Rome and later Europe looked to Greece as their cultural ancestor. To admit Egypt's role would complicate the narrative and diminish Greece's uniqueness. Egypt, meanwhile, was portrayed as mystical, archaic, and static, admired for its pyramids, but dismissed as a source of living knowledge. Egypt treated wisdom as divine inheritance, tied to gods like Thoth. Greece reframed it as human achievement, attributed to thinkers like Pythagoras and Plato. Later historians celebrated the human names and forgot the divine lineage, simplifying the story into one of individual genius. The papyri temples and rituals that preserved Egypt's wisdom were lost or hidden. Greece's texts survived, copied, and studied. Over time, the fragments of Egypt that remained were overshadowed by the polished writings of Greece, leaving only faint echoes of the original source. History simplified the story because simplicity is easier to teach, easier to celebrate, and easier to claim. Yet beneath the marble of Athens lies the stone of Egypt, silent but enduring. The simplified narrative hides the truth that Greece's brilliance was not born in isolation, but was the continuation of Egypt's ancient flame. Would you like me to carry this thread into chapter 19, where we explore how Rome inherited Greece, and in doing so, carried Egypt's wisdom even further into the foundations of Western civilization? The story of Egypt and Greece is not just ancient history. It is a reminder of how knowledge lives, moves, and transforms. To understand why these origins still matter, we must look beyond monuments and myths to the deeper truth. Wisdom is cumulative, inherited, and reshaped across generations. Greece is celebrated for philosophy, mathematics, and science, but its roots lie in Egypt's temples. Recognizing this lineage does not diminish Greece's brilliance. It enriches it. Ideas gain depth when we see the chain of inheritance that carried them forward. The simplified story, Greece as the origin, Egypt as mystery, shaped how the West understood itself. By restoring Egypt's role we challenge that narrative and acknowledge that wisdom is global, not confined to one culture. This matters today as we seek to build inclusive histories that honor all contributions. Egypt treated knowledge as sacred. Greece reshaped it as rational. Both approaches are valuable. Egypt reminds us that wisdom is tied to meaning, balance, and reverence. Greece reminds us that wisdom thrives in dialogue, debate, and openness. Together, they show that knowledge is strongest when it honors both spirit and reason. In a world obsessed with innovation, Egypt teaches us the importance of preservation. In a world that prizes rationality, Egypt reminds us of the sacred dimension of knowledge. Greece teaches us accessibility, dialogue, and inquiry. Both lessons remain relevant as we navigate science, philosophy, and culture today. The silence around Egypt's role is itself a lesson. History often simplifies, erases, or reshapes stories to fit cultural pride. By revisiting these origins, we learn to listen for what was silenced, to honor the forgotten teachers, and to see wisdom as a shared human inheritance. These origins still matter because they remind us that civilization is not built on sudden miracles, but on long chains of preservation and transmission. Egypt kept the flame alive. Greece carried it forward. To remember both is to honor the full story of human wisdom, a story that continues to shape us today. The story of Egypt and Greece is not a tale of rivalry, but of inheritance. Egypt preserved wisdom for millennia, guarding it inside temples, wrapping it in myth, and treating it as sacred. Greece carried fragments of this wisdom home, reshaping them into philosophy, science, and public dialogue. Later, history simplified the story, celebrating Greece as the origin, while leaving Egypt in shadow. But to remember the true foundations is to restore balance. Civilization is not built on sudden miracles. It is built on long chains of preservation and transmission. Egypt kept the flame alive, Greece carried it forward, and Rome later spread it across Europe. Each culture added its own voice, but the roots remain Egyptian, deep, ancient, and enduring. Why does this matter? Because history is not only about what survives, but about what is remembered. To honor Egypt's role is to honor the truth that wisdom is cumulative, that knowledge travels, and that every civilization stands on the shoulders of those who came before. Greece's brilliance shines brighter when we see the Egyptian foundation beneath it. And so, as we close this journey, imagine the temples of Egypt under the stars, their stones whispering of truths preserved for thousands of years. Imagine the academies of Greece, echoing with debates that carried fragments of those truths into a new language. Imagine the long chain of wisdom stretching across time, reminding us that knowledge is never lost, only transformed. The story rests now, like the Nile at night, calm and eternal. The foundations are remembered, the silence lifted, the truth restored. And with that, we let the tale drift into dreams. Good night.